hope you're all doing well. Thank you for attending the event. I won't spend too much time, and we'll get straight on to the guest speaker, which is Amit Dev. So this event is run by LSBU's EquiNet, which is the staff, BAME and Allies network. And what we're essentially celebrating is Asian Heritage Month. So this month runs from the 18th of July to the 17th of August every year. It seeks to raise the profile of British South Asian heritage and history in the UK through education, the arts, culture, and commemoration, with the goal of helping people to better understand the diversity of present-day Britain and to improve social cohesion across the country. It had its inaugural year last year, in 2020, so this is the second year it's running. So South Asian Heritage Month is about reclaiming really the history and identity of British South Asians. People need to be able to tell their own stories, and this is an opportunity to show what it means to be South Asian in the 21st century. Obviously today is focused on the South Asian country of Bangladesh, and we'll look to see how Britain has become more diverse as a country as it is today. South Asian influences can be found everywhere in Britain, from our foods, our clothes, to our music, to even our words. The streets of our towns and cities are really rich in the colours, sights and sounds, and of the proud South Asian identity. Its culture permeates all parts of British life and kind of adds to the diversity of the nation. I won't take any further time. I'd like to introduce to you our guest speaker, Amit Dev, the editor of the British Bengalis. Over to you, Amit.
Thanks, Neil. Great intro, and afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. So just to give you a little bit of background before we move on to the main event, and Neil, please do time manage me because I do ramble on a lot. So if I'm approaching time limits, just let me know and I'll move on. So we've got quite a bit of content for you today to cover. Going to try and cover all of it as much as possible, but we may need to skip a few slides, so I do apologize in advance. So yeah, background in terms of me, I am editor of the British Bengalis social media pages, I'd say. And for my sins, my day job is essentially, I work for a professional services firm and I work in the area of tax advisory, like I said, for my many sins. But anyway, so let's go on to the main event. And what do we want to talk about today is how did Bangladesh get to 50? So the first slide, and what I'm going to do is going to stop my camera actually, just so you can focus on the slides. There you go. And hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So here's the first slide, and it's just literally a summary of our timeline for Bangladesh. So many people will focus between today, where we are now, 2021, and going back to the 26th of March 1971, which is Bangladesh independence, and 50 years in between. But of course, from the British Bengalis perspective anyway, and I should say today we're just going to talk about our perspective through our research, but by all means we are not experts at all. This is just research we've done in our own time. I do recommend and encourage you to do your own research into our fascinating history. So in terms of where do you start? Well, today we're going to start all the way back at 500 CE, moving on to, of course, 1947, partition of India, which is quite an important moment in world history, let alone South Asian history and Bangladeshi history as well. And we've got some blobs at the top. So we got a period of what we like to call a united or undivided Bengal, and then we got division essentially, and we go into the Pakistan era, and then of course we've got Bangladesh from 26th of March 1971 and going forwards. And then we're going to touch on, if we have some time, about the future and what we think is going to happen going forwards in terms of Bangladesh. So looking at 500 CE and moving forwards in time, this is literally pre-Mughal era, really. And we have a period of undivided Bengal. Starting off with 500 CE, we have the first king of Bengal, which is Raja Shashanka. And essentially before 500 CE, Bengal was just a collection of kingdoms. I think even Sylhet, or even parts of Sylhet, were their own individual kingdoms at that point, for example. But come King Shashanka, he managed to consolidate many parts of Bengal. So when I say Bengal, I mean kind of modern day parts of West Bengal, modern day parts of Bangladesh as well were under one kingdom. Then moving a couple of centuries forward, we get to the Pala dynasty, which we call the Buddhist era of Bengal, and it's also considered a golden age where a lot of kind of intellectual thought was invested into. There was a bit of time to do that at that point. And on the left-hand side, if you have been to Rajshahi area of Bangladesh recently, or at least in the last few years, then you've probably seen a scene like this. So this is the Mahavihara in Rajshahi, and it's a Pala dynasty complex, a city almost. And I think at that point it was essentially an educational institute, or even a city. And loads of people from across the Himalayas, India, used to migrate and study at this place. And most of the people in Bengal at that point adhered to Buddhism. And then moving forward a couple of more centuries, we get the Sena dynasty, and this is the Hindu era of Bengal. And at this point, it is where kind of oppression started against Buddhists. So a lot of the Hindu Senas in that dynasty favored Hinduism, and it became an orthodox form of Hinduism that emerged in that period. And then fast forward a few more centuries, and we get to the Islamic era, which we of course see the aftermath of today. And this is around 1205 CE. We get the emergence of the Bengal Sultanate, and this fella here on the right-hand side, bottom right-hand side, if you watch Bollywood, then you will know this is Ranveer Singh, who is a Bollywood actor, and he's playing the part here of Alauddin Khilji. And Alauddin Khilji is not the person who led the Islamic conquest of Bengal. That was probably one of his forefathers anyway, Muhammad Bakhtiar Khilji. He's the one who led that conquest and achieved occupation essentially. So we had kind of pre-Mughal era, then we get to Mughal era. We had the Bengal Sultanate, and then the Mughals came into India, of course, and Bengal was really the last to fall, but it did eventually fall, and it came into the dominion of the Mughal Empire, and we had what's called Bengal Suba. Bengal to the Mughal area was a very, very important region. It was a wealthy region, and it produced it produced so much that it was actually producing half of the whole of India's GDP output. So this chart on the right is sourced from Madison's, who they do a lot of research going back to kind of economic history, and then during the period of the Mughals, what they've derived is essentially a comparison between different regions of the world. So this is world GDP output, and you can see Bengal is a massive 11% on its own. The rest of India is 11%. So India was big, but really Bengal was half of it in terms of GDP output at 11%. And if you took India as a whole, or the Mughal Empire as a whole, that was just behind China, which was at 29%. Rest of the world of 40%. But for me, the most interesting bit was, look at the UK. It's only 2%. It was tiny at that point. And the main reason why Bengal was so rich was because it was really the world leader. And you can kind of argue it almost is today as well in certain respects. well, it was back then, it was a world leader in manufacturing of garments, luxury garments at that point anyway, and in particular muslin. And at this point in time, during the Mughal Empire, Dhaka was actually the capital of Bengal. Back then, I think it was called Jahangirnagar. And back then is where you had all the kind of Muslim weavers who literally handed their trade down to through the generations to their children. And on the left, you have a Mughal maybe princess or someone in that kind of world, the aristocracy, so to speak. We're draped in muslin and muslin and silk, essentially. So Bengal was really was a heavy puncher in terms of an economic power back then. Then after the Mughal period, obviously everyone knows you then had the British era for pretty much 200 years, and it kind of started in the late 1600s, well 1500s really, exploration, and then it really took hold in the 1700s. But it all started with a company called the British East India Company, and they landed in Bengal. And of course, Dhaka was the capital back then, and that was the center. So they avoided that part of Bengal and they went to West Bengal, and they actually managed to purchase 3 villages. And one of them was what we now know as Calcutta. That was a village back then, and they purchased the land where Calcutta is right now. And over, a period of decades and centuries, they transformed Bengal, and it transformed the economic center from Dhaka to Kolkata. And one of the main drivers really at this point of time, which really boomed the economy for the British, was tea. So back then, tea was imported from China. It was a luxury product. Literally only the rich were able to afford tea. And there wasn't many variations, to be honest. But then the British they got richer and richer, but tea demand went through the roof. And the Chinese just increased their prices. So the East India Company started to see an economic downturn in their tea business. So they had to find a solution, and what they managed to find, maybe it was luck or maybe it was a bit of genius on their part, but they managed to find tea, a type of tea in Assam region. And when I say Assam region, what I really mean is Assam and Sylhet, because Sylhet at one point was part of Assam. So, and this is why today, when if any of you are from that Sylhet region or have visited at least, and you've been past districts like Muli Bazar or Sri Mangal areas, you've been through the tea plantations, and that's kind of like a hangover really to that period. So tea was pivotal in the economy, especially the kind of British India economy. And what happened is, as soon as the British discovered tea in this region, Assam Sylhet region, they leveraged whatever they could, and they put all their resources into producing tea in that region, and the price dropped, and essentially tea, which was once a monopoly for China, became dominated by the British. And this is how essentially they got rich. They got rich of tea, and so did many Bengalis actually in that region. And then this middle picture, I should say, so this left picture, I haven't described that yet, I will now, is the old East India House. So the East India Company, there was only a few company offices in here that ran what was back then, and I think it still is actually considered the biggest corporation in the world, with not many employees because everyone was basically a contractor. And then in the middle, you have what is the site of the old East India House, sorry. And you'll probably recognize this building. I took this quite recently when I was in London. This is of course now the Lloyd's building, this futuristic looking building. There's a old facade that's remained from the old Lloyd's building. But what I find is interesting is that for some reason, the British government decided to demolish East India House, even though it plays such a vital part in the history. You would have thought they would have turned it into a museum, but they didn't. I'm sure there's a reason for that. Anyway, moving on. So we had the British period, still got the British period here, but now we've got some political political games, maybe you want to call it, going on here. So we talk about partition or partitions between 1905 and 1947. So in 1905, we had the first partition occur in India. It was isolated just to the Bengal region. And in particular, it was Sylhet really that was split. So you did have a split between West Bengal and kind of Eastern Bengal and Assam, it was called. But really, it's Sylhet, which was part of Bengal, becomes then part of an Assam province, which was really the first split. And the reason for that is probably tea, because Sylhet and Assam obviously were producing tea back then, and they were then joined together, and they produced tea together in one province. And from this split is where you really had the first kind of start of the Swadeshi movement, which is the movement for independence in India. It started in Bengal because of this first partition, essentially, and through this kind of political kind of lobbying and this kind of political movement to go against partition. This partition was then annulled in 1911. But fast forward a few decades, by 1947, it's clear that, or it seems anyway, clear that the people, at least the political parties, want a partition. They want two states following independence. So they want a state of India, and they want a state of Pakistan. And so the Radcliffe lines were drawn, and Bengal was split. But what was undecided was Sylhet. Again, Sylhet is being, should it be split? Should it not be split? That was the question. So instead of the future governments deciding now and the British government or Crown deciding, it was put to the people, but it was put to the people in a rushed way. So you had a referendum essentially being announced on the 3rd of July, just like Brexit, but unlike Brexit, it was held only a few days later on the 6th of July. So people didn't really have much time to decide, to be honest. But anyway, the question that was asked was, should Sylhet join the province of East Bengal in Pakistan? That was the simple question, yes or no. And in terms of those who said yes, that was 56.56%. And those that said no was 43.44%. So majority won. And therefore Sylhet joined East Bengal and became part of Pakistan. But what was a bit weird, if you look at the breakdown on a district by district basis in Sylhet, you'll see that most of the residents in Mulibazar wanted to remain in Assam in India, whereas those in Karimganj wanted to leave and join Pakistan. But obviously today, as you know, Mulibazar is part of, it did leave and it joined East Bengal, whereas Karimganj remained. So not everyone got what they wanted. So you had partition. Millions of people were, of course, displaced because they had to move. Well, they felt like at least they had to leave their ancestral homes, uproot and be displaced and move to a new land. And on that journey, many died. Millions died. But now we have the Pakistan era. And what became quite clear is that there was disproportionate kind of favouring towards one state. And I should really say, and we should really, consider this. It was a difficult proposition to start with. Here we have a state, Pakistan, along with East Pakistan, and they're separated by 1,000 miles of what was back then and pretty much still is hostile Indian territory. So, you know, Pakistan and India, of course, because of how they came to be, were just naturally hostile towards each other equally, probably. So, you know, that's a problem in itself. How do you govern two displaced territories between a hostile neighbor and start off fresh and a whole new country? And what resulted was, or what the Bengalis saw anyway, was that their production was much higher. So they were producing a lot more than West Pakistan. Their population was much higher, but yet the state aid that Pakistan received was disproportionately favored towards West Pakistan. You also saw it in Parliament, you know, in the legislatures, and the civil servants were dominated by the Western wing. And then there was this move towards a single official language. And what should that be? Well, there was a Pakistani census that was held, and it revealed that only 3% of the population spoke Urdu. Despite this, there was a clear move towards Urdu becoming the official language and only language of Pakistan. So I've got a little video here. It's only 10 seconds, and this is the then Governor General and essentially founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and this is him. This is a portion of his speech that he made to a stunned crowd in Dhaka University on the 24th of March 1948. Hopefully you can hear the sound.
Leave no doubt that the state language of Pakistan is going to be Urdu and no other language.
So it's clear from the top, you know, there was orders from the top that Urdu is going to be the official language of Pakistan, despite there being far more Bengalis, they forming the majority, in fact, of the Pakistan state considered together. And pretty much all of those Bengalis spoke Bengali. And there's a deep cultural heritage associated with Bengali and literacy as well. And so a few years passed, and there was many attempts to move forwards to a single language, and then it was getting close to being adopted. Many actions had already been implemented, but by 21st of February 1952, enough was enough, essentially. And what happened is a few students at Dhaka University, they decided to protest. They wanted to protest for their right to use their mother tongue, which, you know, that was handed down through generations. But sadly, many of those died. They were shot dead by the Pakistani army. And the aftermath of that is essentially a mass protest across East Bengal, and eventually the plans to move towards one single official language were halted. And then Bengali was adopted as one of two official languages of Pakistan. So it's a shame that a group of students, you know, young students, had to protest and lose their lives, essentially, just so that everyone today can speak Bengali going forwards as well. And on the right, we have, as you probably know, Shahid Minar, which is a monument essentially to those brave souls. So a few things have happened now, as you can see. So we had a disproportionate sharing of state aid and wealth, essentially, in Pakistan. Bengalis were sidelined. Then you had this movement away from Bengali, trying to potentially cleanse the Bengali culture out of the East Bengalis. And then just before the Pakistan elections, you had a devastating cyclone hit the Bay of Bengal, and East Bengalis were, of course, many were killed, and all, you know, majority were impacted by this event. But unfortunately, the Pakistani government were very slow to react, and enough was enough. And by 1970, Pakistan held a general election. And in this first picture here, this man is Yahya Khan, who was the president of Pakistan at the time. By then, I think he was the third president. And then here, in the middle is Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Let me just check I got that name right. Just one moment. Yeah, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And of course, the third picture is, as we know, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And the contest was really between these two people. So you had Bhutto and you had Sheikh Mujib, who contested these elections, and Sheikh Mujib won by a landslide. Of course, he had the East Bengali vote, where most of the Bengalis resided and was majority of the population of Pakistan. So naturally, it was quite clear he was probably going to win. But what happened is, even though he won, and he had a mandate, and even though it was democracy in action, what happened is Yahya Khan decided to seize the assembly, and he essentially seized the assembly and stopped Sheikh Mujibur Rahman to go into government and form a government, as was mandated by the people. And this continued. They had back and forth discussions, between Yahya Khan, Bhutto, and Sheikh Mujib, but these discussions went nowhere. In fact, a few days before this event that we're going to speak about now happened, Bengal was under martial law imposed by Yahya Khan, and on the 7th of March 1971 was probably the 20th century's most emphatic and impassioned speech, really, delivered by Sheikh Mujib, and it was a call to arms of the people to help one another, whether you're Hindu or Muslim, doesn't matter. You are all brothers in this, and you need to fight for this independence. Now we're now going to declare that we are our own state, and we are going to fight for our freedom. And then by the 26th of March 1971, as you know, was proclamation of independence. So that was Bangladesh Independence Day, effectively, which we celebrate each year. But really, even though it's 26th of March, if you think back to this period, 1971, it wasn't a happy period. This really marks something quite sinister now that happens to the Bengali people. So what started around I think just maybe a day before, or the night of the 25th of March 1971, just before declaration of independence, is the implementation of the Pakistani Army's Operation Searchlight, which was essentially a systematic way of finding Bengalis through local what they call Razakars, so local Bengalis who were sympathetic to the Pakistani cause and who pointed out certain people. So they pointed out Hindus, for example, who were at the point and still are the largest minority in Bangladesh, and at that point East Bengal, to kill, rape those people. In the academics as well, so people who are esteemed academics in certain fields were singled out also, and pretty much anyone else really who was Bengali eventually was captured, tortured, or murdered or raped. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play another video, just a bit of it. I must say a bit of a trigger warning here. It's quite a distressing video, so if you want to move away from your laptop, please do. It'll be around 30 seconds I'm going to play, so you can come back then. I'm going to play it now. And I'm going to forward it a bit as well.
Of Bangladesh. One of the reasons why there is a Bangladesh today is the fact that troops from West Pakistan, Punjabis, savagely terrorized the Bengali population of East Pakistan. Perhaps 1 million people died. Here now is some blurry videotape taken 10 months ago, hidden since then, of how the terror began.
This slightly blurry amateur videotape, which has been kept hidden for the past 9 months, shows Pakistani soldiers executing students, professors, and workers at the University of Dhaka last March 26th. The first sequence shows Pakistani soldiers forcing students to carry and pile up the bodies of victims already killed. The tape was made secretly by a professor of engineering on a portable tape machine hidden on the roof of a building about 300 yards from the killings. A Pakistani execution squad lined up slightly to the right of the center of the screen. About 20 people were herded onto the killing ground from the right corner of the picture. One man...
So I'm going to stop that right there because it gets quite graphic, so I don't want to play the next bit, but I think you've kind of caught the drift what happens later, and this was recorded, you know, in secret. So it was a terrible time for Bengalis, even though we do celebrate that period each year, if anything, to remember those that have departed and sacrificed their lives. So very quickly we kind of came to know that something's happening. This is genocide essentially, but the many cries, and this is just a collage of the cries, you know, that were made to the West especially, just fell on deaf ears. So you have on the left here is a telegram from Archer Blood called the Blood Telegram. This was back in April 1971, which was sent to Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who basically ignored it. And this detailed what was happening essentially, which was genocide. Then we had a Times article by Anthony Mascarenhas, who was a Pakistani journalist. I understand a group of them went to East Bengal, a group of journalists, but they were instructed to only write positively of what was happening. But Anthony Mascarenhas was the only one that told the truth, and he had to then subsequently flee Pakistan and go into exile. Then we had Stop Genocide by, at the time, a famous East Bengali director. You can see, if you just Google it, you'll find it on YouTube, and it's of the camps and what's happened, and some interviews as well. It's quite an interesting documentary, essentially. We had the Shadin Bangla football team tour India to explain, basically raise awareness of what's happening and raise some funds as well to help their fellow countrymen. And then, of course, you had George Harrison and Ravi Shankar's Concert for Bangladesh, which raised millions to help alleviate what was the wrongs that were happening. And of course, you had the Liberation War. Bengalis were not just going to lie down and let what was happening continue. So you had the formation of the Mukti Bahini, which was a collection of military trained personnel who then trained civilians. My uncle was actually part of the Mukti Bahini, and he fought, and he did survive the war to tell the tale. And then you had just this mass of refugees as well go across to India. So I'm just getting a call from Neil, and I think I've just got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to quickly wrap this up swiftly. So you had a mass of refugees essentially crossing the Indian border on both sides, West Bengal and Assam and Tripura. There is a film here of a camp. If you want to, I won't play it now because it's quite long actually, but if you go to Huntley Archives, you'll be able to see a video of the refugee camps in India of East Bengalis that fled the war. Around 10 million is the quoted figure of people that fled my mother in this post on the British Bengalis page. You'd be able to read that if you want to, and the video's on there as well, actually, so you could view it there. She had to flee with my brother, who was very young at the time, and she tells her story in this post. So if you're interested, please do have a read. There's another quoted figure as well of I think around between 200,000 and maybe 400,000 women were raped during this period. But, you know, we did fight, and eventually by 16th December 1971, we got our freedom. And this is the signing of the instrument of surrender between India, and India got involved, of course, as you know, helped Bangladesh fight for liberation. And this is the signing between India on behalf of Bangladesh and between Pakistan. And now I'm going to go through the remaining slides as swiftly as possible now. This is now bringing us to kind of today period. So between 70s and 2000s, all I want to say on this slide is, if you remember back to hearing or watching documentaries referring to this period, then you know that Henry Kissinger famously labeled Bangladesh as a basket case, i.e. it's never going to be developed. You know, it's always going to be in this cycle of flood here, devastation, political instability. These two famous people still fighting, of course, politically speaking. There was mass killings. Sheikh Mujib was assassinated, so was Ziaur Rahman. And of course, there's this humanitarian crisis that happened through those decades. But during this period as well is where you have the development starting of Bangladesh that no one really reports. This is where the road building and infrastructure building started to happen. And then we fast forward to the 2000s, and today, of course, we've got loads of beautiful, positive stories now coming out of Bangladesh. We have our first Nobel laureate, Mohammed Yusuf, and he essentially masterminded kind of microcredit, which is essential in developing countries, of course. Finance is essential everywhere, and microcredit essential in developing countries. Bangladesh has done quite well during the pandemic in terms of in terms of economic output, and then you had the rise of the expat, or as many of them called, migrants or immigrants. That has really helped the Bangladesh economy. And Bangladesh was also one of the first countries to go, not completely, but at least go towards being as green as possible. So CNG gas, for example, in all vehicles, and the banning of plastic, single-use plastics. And of course, now we've got COVID, and Bangladesh has been hit like any other country, but like I said, economically, it's been doing quite well. Our cricket team's quite good. Hopefully one day we can win the Cricket World Cup. We've got an Olympic team on presence. Hopefully one day we'll win one medal. And in terms of the future, so there's this Vision 2041, and there's a lot of objectives here. You can just Google it. This is on Wikipedia, and essentially the key kind of drivers to go forward is 9% GDP growth, and to get a per capita income of around $12,500. And the next slide just gives you some results. So in 2019, Bangladesh was on 1855, India 2099, Pakistan 1284. So Bangladesh is already ahead, and then of Pakistan. And in 2020, but not India, but in 2020, Bangladesh is at 1970. This is GDP per capita, I should say, in dollars. And it's ahead of India slightly, but which is at 1964, and then Pakistan's at 1260. But obviously, it's got a long way to go, even to reach China, and then even further to go to reach UK, USA standards. But it's made a lot of progress. You can see literacy rates have gone high, really high, to 72.76%, which is encouraging. Poverty has been reduced, and life expectancy has shot up from the 1960s average of around 45 to now, which is like 72.8 or something like that. And so just to wrap up now, sorry I had to breeze through those slides, but just to wrap up. So if you do want to explore this history even further, then here's 3 books I recommend: A History of Bangladesh, Land of Two Rivers, and Anarchy. They're really good books. I do recommend those. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
I know I'm meant to be hosting, but I'm okay to ask a question. Ahmed, you can go first if you like.
Is that me? Is that because I've got my hand out?
Yeah, Mushrat, yes.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to ask what, it's probably a big question, Amit, but what is the future for Bangladesh now, knowing that we've gone back to the sort of textiles trade, poverty still remains, but a lot has improved. But what's the future direction for Bangladesh?
Thank you for that question. That's a massive question, and I'll try and answer it in my own way. And this is my personal thoughts, obviously, and I'm sure you have your own. So in terms of the future, I think we're doing quite well. I mean, textiles is a valuable industry, and Bangladesh is doing obviously quite well in it. It's leading in this trade, but the problem is it's not really recognized. How many people in the West know about this trade and what happens in the background? We've heard about these, and we've probably seen and maybe participated in some recent social media campaigns. You know, the pay up, because quite a few garment workers weren't being paid during the pandemic. But I think Bangladesh needs to recognize what's happening and needs to fight its cause and say, hey, you know, we are here, we are doing this, treat our workers well. And, you know, I think we need to go into the luxury part of this sector. One thing that stumps me really is, I mean, even my mum's worked in these types of factories in the UK. But what stumps me is how many Bengalis do you see on Western catwalks, even though many of their family members may be in this industry. So I think it's about raising awareness really, and then I think the economy will follow. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important that we look after the people who are making those garments. I feel like we're still in his master's house when I see the reports and things.
Agreed.
We've got one here from Muji, just in the comments. I'll read it out for Muji. What was the most difficult part of research in Bangladesh in terms of history, lost, inaccessible knowledge?
That's a good question. Thank you, Muji. All of it is quite difficult because firstly, this is the main problem. You don't get much exposure in Britain anyway. I didn't when I was growing up. I mean, I'm showing my age now, but I didn't get much exposure as I was growing up through the schooling system in this area. I did not appreciate at all what vibrant history we have. So the first thing is understanding there is a gap. I think once you understand there's a gap, is then about, obviously, the world's your oyster. You know, Google is out there and can be your friend, but it takes a long time trying to search through viable sources. It's not like British history where, you know, there's certain books that you can read and that's it, you get it. For Bangladesh or Bengali history, it's not like that. And in fact, you need to read the history through Western lenses often, which could be muddied. So every book or every article you read, you need to take it with a pinch of salt, really. But those 3 books that I've recommended, they're very good. They seem to me anyway to be as unbiased as possible, and they're quite comprehensive, but they still have gaps.
Thank you, Amit. I think someone's up there. So we've got another question here from Sanki. Thank you for the excellent presentation, firstly. I wanted to know how Bangladesh managed to achieve relatively high economic growth in the pandemic, considering it's so close to India and the Delta variant probably has spread widely as well. How did they manage the situation there?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and many better minded people will be able to probably provide you with a better answer, especially from an economic one. But my understanding, reading this recently, if I've understood it correctly, is to do with prudent expenditure controls in government and investing in the right areas, and especially being in textiles, even though you do have this issue with payment to the workers, which is a massive issue. But what you've had though is strong economic growth for a few decades now in Bangladesh, which has helped it ride through the pandemic, and quite prudent controls through governments. So you had the infrastructure investment in the 80s, 90s, which if you guys have been to Bangladesh during that time, you would see year after year if you were visiting, or even a few years after, you'd see the massive improvement. Even now you see improvements when you go back home, so to speak. So that's helped. The infrastructure's helped a lot. You've got the remittances from expats. Bangladesh has loads of expats, and it needs that expat community to remit back to Bangladesh, because you have loads in the Gulf, obviously, and loads in the UK, of course, like yourselves, some of you, and of course it's had also some. Bangladesh realised quite quickly that textiles was its #1 really industry to support, and I understand through taxation, through some bonded warehousing, not to go into the technical details of that now, but that's enabled businesses to a lot of businesses to get off the ground really, and move into this space, and let it become one of the leaders in the world.
Brilliant. We've just got someone typing away, might be a question, but just one from me. I myself am a British Bangladeshi myself. And I just wanted to touch on a bit about kind of this migration and the expat into the UK. I think I fall under probably a 3rd generation in this country. And I think we might be heading into the 5th generation. Correct me if I'm wrong. Can you just kind of talk us through kind of the journey potentially that the 1st generation potentially had, and the challenges that they might have had in coming into Britain, and how they actually got access to come into Britain?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and thank you for asking it. So I mean, in terms of 1st generation, in my family, that would be my parents. So when my dad came over, for example, he came over in 1963, and when he came over, he said, he didn't know any English. Basically, he didn't know anything. He was only 21 at the time, I think, and he remembers it being very cold. That age-old kind of story that generation tends to tell. But the challenge, he said, was trying to navigate through this country where they weren't seen, they weren't welcomed. I mean, this term expat and immigrant are essentially the same thing, but we know socially they mean 2 different things, and we know they're resigned to certain individuals. So expat in particular and immigrant. And my dad probably fell in the immigrant camp, and we know what connotations that has. So he didn't feel welcome at first, and he had to navigate through this complex social fabric in the UK, where you're Bengali, your family's at home, You're just here to work, but then you need to make sure you get on with, you know, the British folk to make sure you can get up the ladder, the career ladder, if there is one open to you or not. So they literally just, any abuse that was shouted, I understand, to this group of people, to this generation, they just sucked it up and, you know, didn't really fight back, because all they wanted to do is survive for their family. They just wanted to take their family to the next step. So then they sacrificed themselves essentially, instead of going out and, you know, having a great time every weekend like a lot of us probably do now. But then they had to sacrifice all of that for the greater good of their family. And there's a really good documentary on BBC Three which sums this up. It's by Ali Official, who many of you probably follow him. He's a comedian, British Bengali comedian, and he says, you know, his parents, you know, it sounds like they're a similar generation to mine. They just wanted to survive, but the generation below, so my generation, I'm second generation, in my kind of family, we want to live or thrive. You know, we don't want to just survive. We want to do more. So I think that's what the difference is. But we need to remember the sacrifices and the pain that the first generation went through, because they're the enablers, right? They're the heroes. They've enabled us to thrive. And without them, you know, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Thank you for that, Amit. We'll just stay on a bit more, guys. If anyone has any more questions, feel free. If not, Dean, we okay to get everything to a close?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Brilliant. Guys, thank you for everyone who attended. If you do have anything more, please do drop them in the comments. Really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you again, Amit, for presenting for us. It's been very insightful, and a lot of things that we probably didn't know about. And thank you for really taking us and giving the Bangladeshi viewpoint of kind of the South Asian Heritage Month. Guys, we do have more events for the South Asian Heritage Month running. This was hosted by LSBU and the EquiNet network at the university. Guys, everyone have a very good day and take care for the rest of the evening. Thank you again, Amit. Everyone take care.
Thank you.